Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction that found its roots nearly 40 years ago and hasn't seemed to lose any steam when it comes to telling stories. It focuses on a dystopian futuristic setting that puts a spotlight on combining high tech and low life, often featuring massive technological and scientific advancements, whether it be cybernetics, human augmentations, or artificial intelligence, sitting in contrast to societal collapse or breakdown in social order. Oftentimes, corrupt corporations and governments run the world and receive praise for whatever advancements in technology there are, all while ignoring or even exploiting the lower class and creating a massive divide within society. Due to the massively awaited video game Cyberpunk 2077 by CD Projekt Red that was announced all the way back in May of 2012, it seems video games have made a massive trend in adopting cyberpunk aspects a lot more often. But CD Projekt Red's long-awaited title is not the birth of cyberpunk video games. In fact, it's not even close to it. So today, let's take a look back at a brief history of cyberpunk video games. The highly experimental fiction movement of the 1960s and 70s called New Wave Science Fiction laid a foundation for cyberpunk to grow. Authors like Philip K. Dick, K.W. Jeter, and John Brunner, and many others explored outside the window of utopian tendencies that science fiction of the time had by writing on controversial societal issues like drug culture, growing technologies, and sexual liberation. Philip K. Dick's novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep in 1968 is often considered the prototype for the cyberpunk movement. The story follows a bounty hunter who is tasked with killing 6 escaped androids in a post-apocalypse San Francisco. It painted the ideal picture of a post-economic collapse dystopia, presenting ethical and moral dilemmas in regards to artificial intelligence in a very realistic way. Other authors continue to build off this philosophical idea, such as John Brunner with his 1975 novel The Shockwave Rider, a story of a computer hacker trying to escape pursuit in a dystopian future, as well as K.W. Jeter's 1972 novel Dr. Adder, a story of a surgeon who modifies sexual organs of his patients to satisfy the weirdest of perversions. The first use of the term cyberpunk came as the title of a short story by Bruce Bethke, written in 1980. Bethke was in pursuit of coining a term that encompassed both punk attitudes and advanced technology. He made 2 lists of words, one for technology and one for troublemakers, and eventually settled on cyberpunk. Bethke's short story was published in the sci-fi magazine Amazing Stories in 1983, 1 year before the quintessential cyberpunk novel was published, William Gibson's Neuromancer, which gave birth to a new archetype in the cyberpunk genre, virtual reality, with the human mind being fed light-based worldscapes through a computer interface. The 60s and the 70s built a nest for cyberpunk to grow, and when the subgenre was officially birthed in the 80s, it took off and never stopped. Literature continued to explore and expand on ideas. Movies started to build these worlds and give a glimpse into the incredibly foreign landscapes that these stories laid out. Movies like Bladerunner, which was based on the proto-cyberpunk novel itself, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, while Bladerunner portrayed the technological advanced cities and a a perfect contrast with societal decay, the same year in 1982, Tron portrayed cyberpunk a little more intimately, from the inside of a computer mainframe, creating an equally iconic worldscape for the genre as Bladerunner by portraying the potential computer-generated imagery and innovation. The 80s continue to explode with cyberpunk movies. Terminator, RoboCop, Videodrome, Escape from New York, The Running Man. And it's not just live action movies. Anime is one of the biggest contributors to the depiction of the genre, with works like Megazone 23, Neo Tokyo, Akira, and Appleseed. Two incredible tabletop RPG games also came out in the 80s, one being Shadowrun and the other simply titled Cyberpunk. Both games being heavy inspirations to future cyberpunk video games, as we'll soon go over. Shadowrun built a fictional world in the near future, mixing typical cyberpunk tropes with a world of magic and fantasy, while Cyberpunk focused on the governmental collapse and a world fully taken over by megacorporations. Comic books like anime were another breakaway in the genre, depicting worlds in such an expressive way while also having masterful narrative on the intricacies of the genre's roots. Titles like The Long Tomorrow, Transmetropolitan, Tokyo Ghost, and Judge Dredd all has significant presence in not only the world of comic books, but as works of cyberpunk fiction.
Oh my God, Daddy!
What a shame.
He can't really be. There must be something we can do.
He was a good man. What a rotten way to die.
It's no surprise that Cyberpunk didn't take long to enter the growing world of video games. Honestly, the medium is just perfectly tailored for the genre. The 80s explosion in Cyberpunk bled into the growing technological advancements of gaming and brought with it some amazing titles. In 1985, a game called The Screamer was released by Magical Zoo. The game was set after World War III and revolved around both cyberpunk and sci-fi horror elements. And a couple years later, in 1987, Imitation City, a simple cyberpunk adventure game, was made by Jiro Ishii. The same year, Metal Gear, a game that I don't personally consider cyberpunk because while it does feature a lot of high-tech and corrupt governments, the low-life aspect was missing, at least from this title. A term called post-cyberpunk is often used to describe the Metal Gear games, as it places a more realistic look at the integration of highly advanced technologies within society. You know, without the megacorporations and all that. The creator of the game though, Hideo Kojima, would end up being pivotal in cyberpunk video games because the next year, in 1988, he released Snatcher. Snatcher is a cyberpunk graphic adventure game developed and published by Konami, and like I mentioned, it was written and designed by Kojima. Snatcher is set in a future East Asian metropolis where humanoid robots called Snatchers have been discovered killing humans and replacing them within society. You play as an amnesiac member of a Snatcher hunting agency in search of his past. Kojima designed the game with cyberpunk cinema in mind, taking inspiration from films like Bladerunner, Akira, and Terminator. Snatcher is the first game to lean heavy into the philosophical and ethical ideas of cyberpunk, the same way that the authors did back in the 60s and 70s, rather than just make a game surrounding the visuals for the genre built from films and comics in the 80s. And for that reason, Snatcher is what I would consider the first actual cyberpunk video game. The same year, in 1988, the games Akira and Neuromancer were both released as well. Akira, developed by Tosei, being based on the anime film of the same name, which is in turn based on the manga of the same name. And Neuromancer, developed by Interplay, being loosely based on the 1984 William Gibson novel of the same name, taking place both in the real world as well as the virtual world of cyberspace coined in the novel. 1989 had Genocide, developed by Zoom Inc., a side-scrolling action game in a world where the supercomputer named Mesa, tasked with monitoring everything that happens in the planet, becomes increasingly megalomaniac and decides to take over the world. 1990 had Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, a direct follow-up to Kojima's massive title a few years earlier. 1992 brought Dreamweb and Flashback. Dreamweb, developed by Creative Reality, was a top-down point-and-click adventure game where you play as a bartender in a futuristic dystopian city, and your dreams have been taken over by an entity called Dreamweb. Flashback, developed by Delphine Software International, was a cinematic platforming game where the main character loses his memory after he crash lands his hover bike. and he finds a holocube telling him to meet someone in the jungle on the moon Titan. 1993 was perhaps the next big year in the foundation of cyberpunk video games. Beam Software released Shadowrun for the SNES. Based on the tabletop RPG of the same name, the video game was an action RPG that combined the statistical element from the tabletop into the real-time action of the virtual world. The game opens with the main character Jake being gunned down in the street, and a shape-shifting figure is seen rushing to his side to cast a spell that resurrects him once he reaches the morgue with memory loss. Yet another game with an amnesiac main character. The rest of the game follows Jake as he searches for those responsible and for answers for their actions. In the same year of 1993, Bullfrog Productions released Syndicate, an isometric real-time strategy game set in a dystopian future, in which corporations have replaced governments and you, the player, take the role as one of these corporations, competing for global dominance.
I am Shodan.
After Wolfenstein 3D was released in 1992, we started to change the way that we view digital worlds, quite literally, through the first-person perspective. The next step in gaming immersion was here. You could literally take a step into the character's shoes and see what they see. It flipped the script on video games as a whole, and in 1994 it was no different for the cyberpunk genre, once Looking Glass Technologies released System Shock. System Shock is a first-person action-adventure game that takes place in a large, multi-level space station owned by a megacorporation called Tri-Optimum. The main character is a nameless hacker who is caught trying to hack into the corporation's systems, and is tasked with hacking Shodan, the artificial intelligence that runs the space station, in lieu of any punishment for trying to hack into their system. The game features rogue AI, cybernetic implants, and of course, computer hacking, all iconic tropes of the cyberpunk genre, but from the influence of this game's success, now iconic tropes in all of gaming. 1994 had several cyberpunk titles other than just System Shock. Games like Revolution Software's Beneath the Steel Sky, set in a post-apocalypse dystopia where corporations have laid new order over the remaining world. Burn Cycle from Trip Media was a unique title featuring full motion video and a point-and-click adventure. A computer hacker ends up with a nasty virus in his brain called the Burn Cycle, giving him and the player a real-time 2-hour deadline to find a cure. Hell, a cyberpunk thriller by Take-Two Interactive was another FMV point-and-click adventure where a dystopian USA in 2095 is under rule of a fascist group called the Hand of God. Unlike theocracies of the past, this government can send criminals straight to hell. A racing title called Delta V by Bethesda Softworks takes place in a future run by corporations, and they hire hackers to acquire data, which has become the currency of the time. You fly a virtual craft through cyberspace in an effort to steal data from different corporations. A fighting game called Rise of the Robots, developed by Mirage, was also released. A game where corporations rule the dystopian future and society is governed by robots and automated servants, and a virus breaks into the overruling robots and results in chaos and havoc. And for some reason, robots fistfighting is the end scenario. Hideo Kojima had another cyberpunk work this year as well, with Police Nauts. It follows an LA detective who is a police naut, or police officers who are trained to be astronauts to protect one of America's first space colonies. The story follows tropes of space travel, interplanetary societies, as well as the devious underworld of organ harvesting in a dystopian future. In the next year, 1995, Origin Systems released Cybermage Darklight Awakening, a first-person shooter RPG taking place in the typical corporation-run dystopia with rebel groups rising up and fighting back, creating cybernetic implants that begin to produce hybrid humans. The protagonist has a gem implanted in his forehead called the Darklight, a stone of magical power. 1996 was a great year for sequels as it brought the second Syndicate game with Syndicate Wars, developed again by Bullfrog Productions. This was a sequel to the first game, only taking place 95 years after the events of the first. Rise 2 Resurrection was released by Mirage as a sequel to Rise of the Robots. It improved on the graphics and animations of the first game and essentially followed the same plot as the first title. After the year of sequels, 1997 was the year of film adaptations. Westwood Studios released Bladerunner, not as a direct adaptation granted, but presented as a sidequel, an original story that runs parallel to the events of the movie, often intersecting with it, as well as Exact's Ghost in the Shell, loosely based on the film 2 years prior, which is in turn based on the manga of the same name. 1998 gave us Einhander, a scrolling shooter game developed by Square. It takes place in the far future in the midst of an ongoing war between Earth and the Moon. Square released another Cyberpunk title the same year called Xenogears, an RPG that followed several protagonists as they journey across the world to overthrow the all-powerful rule of Solaris and uncover mysteries concerning their world. In 1999, Looking Glass and Irrational Games teamed up to develop System Shock 2. The game that they were making wasn't meant to be a sequel to System Shock until EA took over the publishing and made it so. The game again takes place on a massive spaceship, and you play as a soldier trying to stop the spread of a genetic infection aboard the ship. The game features first-person combat, psionic capabilities, hacking, and of course devious artificial intelligence with the reintroduction of Shodan, the iconic villain AI from the first game. This game has gone down in history as one of the best and most influential games of all time, and it leads the cyberpunk genre as well with its fantastic interpretation of technology that has gone too far in the hands of megacorporations. The next year and the turn of the century brought perhaps one of the best titles of the cyberpunk genre, Ion Storm's action RPG Deus Ex. Taking place in a dystopian universe where conspiracy theories are all true, like Area 51, Men in Black, and the Illuminati. Society is slowly spiraling into chaos, and the rich and the poor are heavily divided, sometimes even physically, and a deadly plague is destroying the human population. A synthetic vaccine called Ambrosia is made and nullifies the effects of the virus, but only the elites have access to it, causing riots and worldwide uprisal of terrorist organizations. You play as a soldier of an anti-terrorism unit equipped with nanotechnology, making you essentially a superhuman. 2001 had games like Oni from Bungie West. Heavily inspired by Akira and Ghost in the Shell, this third-person shooter and brawler takes place in a world run by a singular totalitarian government that heavily restricts the freedom and liberties of its population. Uplink by Introversion Software was a hacker simulation game where you play as a freelance hacker breaking into computers, completing contracts and upgrading your hardware to hack into increasingly difficult computer systems. Over the next several years, there was many games that started to take cyberpunk themes and elements and apply them to vastly different styles of gameplay. In 2002, a game called Neocron was released by Rector Media, a game that can be considered Cyberpunk's first MMORPG. It takes place in a cyberpunk 28th century, fused with post-apocalypse imagery following a giant war between North America and China. Deus Ex's first sequel, Invisible War, was released in 2003, taking place 20 years after the events of the first game. Alongside the first game adaptation of the Matrix movies, Enter the Matrix, also releasing in 2003. Enter the Matrix was an action-adventure style game that was made not only to be based on the movies, but also added canon lore to the Matrix series, giving fans of the series something new. Another cyberpunk movie game adaptation in 2005 was released with Aeon Flux. This game was released the same year as the film and was made in only 10 months, and like the Matrix game, it aimed to add some more backstory to the existing media. Also in 2005, a game called Dystopia was released by Team Dystopia. It was a team-based, objective-driven first-person shooter created as a mod on Valve's Source engine. It has incredibly strong influences from cyberpunk aesthetic and claims to be inspired primarily by Shadowrun. This is perhaps the first title in this video built solely as a mod. The next year in 2006, Human Head Studios released Prey, another immersive sim-type game similar to and influenced by System Shock and Deus Ex. The game is focused on a native Cherokee American named Tommy, who is abducted into a spaceship along with his girlfriend and grandfather. Tommy's Native American spirit allows his spirit to roam freely and come back to life after dying. Shadowrun was rebooted in 2007 as a first-person shooter rather than an RPG. It was more of a game taking place in the Shadowrun's universe than a detailed and methodical world that was originally built in the tabletop RPG game. Mirror's Edge, a first-person parkour game made by DICE, was released in 2008. The game follows the protagonist Faith Connors, an underground parkour courier who transmits messages while avoiding the watchful eye of government surveillance. In 2011, Gemini Rue, a graphic adventure game set in the 23rd century, was released using a point-and-click style gameplay to solve puzzles and chat with different characters. Deus Ex Human Revolution was also released in the same year, yet another entry into the staple Cyberpunk series. This title is set as a prequel to the original title, taking place 25 years before in the year 2027. 2012 was the year that everything changed, even before the world knew it. Other than yet another classic Cyberpunk title being rebooted as a first-person shooter with Starbreeze Studios' Syndicate, 2012 was the year CD Projekt Red announced Cyberpunk 2077. At this point, the game company was highly respected for their Witcher series of games with Witcher 1 and Witcher 2, and this announcement of Cyberpunk caused some big hype in the industry. A few more Cyberpunk titles were released in the following years. Shadowrun was brought back to its roots with the appropriately named Shadowrun Returns in 2013, a return of the universe to the tactical RPG style, fully funded on Kickstarter, and also made with the creator of the original tabletop game, Jordan Wiseman. The game also had a massive DLC the next year in 2014 called Dragonfall that was eventually released as a standalone title. Also in 2013, Deus Ex had another entry called The Fall, and it really was the fall of the series. The IP wanted to branch out into the potential growth of mobile gaming, and this game was made for iOS. It wasn't a terrible game, but it did not measure up to the consistent bangers that fans were used to from the series. 2013 also had an original title called Remember Me, a game that yet again has an amnesiac protagonist. The main character, Nilin, is a memory hunter in an underground renaissance group called the Errorist. She was stripped of all her memories by an evil megacorporation called the Memorize. The game's intent was to provide a thought-provoking narrative with a female protagonist. It had strong ambitions and it did pretty well. It was also the debut title from Don't Nod Entertainment, who went on to make Life is Strange and Vampire. Supergiant Games released their second title, Transistor, in 2014 after their massive debut with the game Bastion. Transistor is a real-time combat style game in an isometric view. You play as Red, a singer in the city Cloudbank that's been attacked by a robotic force. She comes in possession of a sword called the Transistor, which has her voice sealed inside of it. Also in 2014, the game Watch Dogs was released by Ubisoft. The game follows a hacker and vigilante Aiden Pierce as he looks for revenge over the killing of his niece, taking place in a 2013 Chicago-inspired city. Similar to Metal Gear, Watch Dogs is more of a post-cyberpunk setting. There is rampant technology and high-tech, low-life interactions, but it's a much more realistic interpretation of technology's advancements. 2015 was the year that the big boom happened. CD Projekt Red released The Witcher 3 and got attention from the entire world with its massive success, which in turn cranked the hype over their new Cyberpunk game to 11. In 2015, Shadowrun had a new entry titled Hong Kong. Call of Duty's Black Ops 3 campaign drew some heavy influences from cyberpunk tropes, and several new games were also released. A 2D side-scrolling adventure game called Dex was released. It follows a young woman named Dex trying to escape a secret authority called the Complex, and a city that is run by corrupt corporations. A point-and-click adventure game released called Techno Babylon. The game takes place in a city called Newton Newton, run by an AI called the Central, which maintains the city's systems and enforces the law. Citizens spend their time in virtual reality called trance, where they communicate with each other and live out their lives. Another point-and-click adventure game was released called 2064 Read-Only Memories, a game where personal robot assistants have taken over cell phones and computers for most people. The game follows a journalist and their robot assistant named Turing as they investigate a kidnapping. Turing is the first sapient robot that can learn and grow emotionally. The game was designed to be very LGBTQ forward and focuses on a future where there is less discrimination and even allows the player to choose which pronouns that they would like to be used. A real-time tactics game called Satellite Rain was released. The game was made because the developer was the lead programmer of Syndicate in 1993 and he didn't care for the FPS reboot of the game in 2012. So he decided to make a spiritual successor to the original game. And finally in 2015, a survival horror game called Soma was released. Soma takes place in an underwater remote research facility that contains machinery which are exhibiting human characteristics such as consciousness. The next year in 2016 had 3 great sequels to established Cyberpunk games, with Deus Ex Mankind Divided, a direct sequel to Human Revolution and a prequel to Deus Ex. Watch Dogs 2 taking place 2 years after the first game, following a different hacker named Marcus Holloway, a hacker that joins a group called DedSec to take down a fictional San Francisco surveillance system known as CTOS. In Mirror's Edge Catalyst, a direct sequel to Mirror's Edge, following Faith again as she recovers from the events that took place in the first game. 2016 had 2 original Cyberpunk titles as well. One being Invisible Inc., a turn-based tactics game. The game is set in the year 2074 after megacorporations have overthrown the world's national governments and taken control. Invisible Inc. is a private intelligence agency providing services to corporations, performing infiltrations using field agents and a sophisticated AI system known as Incognita. Also in 2016 was Valhalla, an indie bartender simulation game with visual novel elements. The game puts the player as a bartender in a small bar in a dystopian downtown, which is said to attract the most fascinating of people. Gameplay consists of players making and serving drinks to bar attendees while listening to their stories and experiences. The next year in 2017, Bethesda made a reboot of Prey. It's largely unrelated to the original title in 2006, but more of a reimagining of the IP set with a new narrative. A psychological horror game named Observer was released. You play as a detective of an Observer police force who can hack people's brain implants with a device called Dream Eater for interrogation purposes. A top-down shooter called Runer was also released in 2017, taking place in the year 2091 in a cyberpunk metropolis. You control a silent protagonist in pursuit to save his brother from an evil conglomerate. The last few years have had a number of amazing cyberpunk video games. A few notable titles include the Red Strings Club in 2018, another narrative-focused adventure game where you're serving up drinks to patrons as a bartender, but that's only a portion of the gameplay in this wonderful indie title. Astral Chain in 2019 was a breakout hack-and-slash game for Nintendo Switch. The game follows a special police task force as they protect humanity from interdimensional creatures. And this year, in 2020, we got Ghostrunner, an action platforming style game that plays a lot like Mirror's Edge but also integrates some combat. You jump around and navigate yourself through a giant tower that holds the rest of humanity in this dystopian future of a world. Also, Watch Dogs Legion came out this year. This title taking place in a fictionalized London and lets you play as various different characters rather than one main protagonist. And of course, Cyberpunk 2077 is released this year. It's probably in its early stages of release as this video goes up, but it's still the climax of the genre, at least as of right now. It's CD Projekt Red's action-adventure RPG follow-up to their Witcher games, and only time will tell if this game is worth the hype of 8 years or not. The trend of 80s nostalgia in the last few years has been growing, and it seems like cyberpunk imagery as a baby of those times is growing just alongside it. There's no telling if the trend will keep going on for very long, but if the history of cyberpunk video games has shown us anything, it's that the roots of cyberpunk are the inspiration to many iterations of different games. From the novelists back in the 60s and 70s, to the 80s movies that put visuals to these crazy concepts, to the video games offering interactivity in such an interesting and complex world, with series like Shadowrun, Deus Ex, System Shock, and Watch Dogs. The trend will continue to grow and be harkened back on. Already in the future, we can look forward to games like System Shock 3 being released, or new IPs bringing cyberpunk further, like the game called The Last Night. I for one hope that there's no end to cyberpunk video games. I hope that you enjoyed this video as I briefly discussed the history of cyberpunk video games. I have a couple other videos of this same style, one covering the brief history of survival horror games, and one covering the brief history of post-apocalypse games. I really enjoy putting the time into these videos because the history and progression of different genres and themes is just super interesting to me. If you liked it, maybe check out the other videos of this style, and of course, like the video and subscribe if you want to keep up with my content. If you have any suggestions for future brief history videos, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you're interested in seeing. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.